what are your pains and gains? An example of a pain is you don't want to be embarrassed. An example of a gain is you can enjoy a show better. So you can make a list of your pains and gains. The more you know about that, and the more you can understand yourself.
Hello, Timo. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Marty. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And for anybody that is not yet familiar with who you are and what you do, anybody listening to this, could you introduce yourself to us?
Sure. My name is Timo. I started teaching English as a second language a little more than 20 years ago, and I spent about 15 years in the industry. And right around the COVID pandemic, I decided to start up my own business.
Perfect. And why did you get into that? What was your drive behind starting to do what you do?
Yeah, I taught around the world for about 15 years. I taught in a bunch of different countries and some different cultures, and I was also able to learn a few languages myself. And through that time working in language schools, I noticed a bit of a gap between the instruction they were doing and the ability of the student to learn a language. And when I learned languages, I didn't go the book route. Mine was more of a usage-based theory, how I learned the language as well. So after that, I helped start up a couple startup companies through a university in the USA. So I learned firsthand from a couple of scientists how they started their own companies. So I said, let me put my experience together and start a new company myself.
For sure, for sure. And you mentioned that with your own experience of learning languages, you also didn't quite go the book route, but it was more, like you said, more practical, perhaps more experimental. What does that mean? What did that look like?
Yeah, I had kind of funny stories, over and over. A student would come to me who could do a grammar exercise really well. They could take a book and fill out everything and get 100%, but then they would go try to order a coffee, and they just want to say, "Can I have a black coffee?" And they couldn't understand or be understood. So little things like that. And I started to see over time that there was a gap between what you might know and what you might have in your head versus what you can do in your reality. So I decided over time, I changed my teaching methodology a bit. It became more usage based when I teach. And when I finally started my own business, one of my slogans was activate the knowledge already inside you. Because I found that a lot of times people have more language abilities than they can use. They have more vocabulary knowledge than they actually use. And then on the other side, you also have to be able to understand when somebody else speaks to you. And so those are things you can't really get in a book.
Certainly, certainly. And you're very right, Timo, and that's something that I notice myself very often that, like you said, I can read, I can listen is a little bit questionable sometimes as well, but
Yeah,
reading is usually the perfect skill and I understand all the words and
yeah.
everything is great. But like you said, I can't really use it myself, and that's where most people get stuck. You're very, very right. So how
Mm,
do
Do you
you help? Yeah, please.
do you speak another language other than English?
I do. I speak Polish and I would say maybe like a A2 of Spanish, so not super, super high
Okay,
yet. I
okay,
don't really
wow,
spend enough
wow.
time on that, but a
Yeah, I
little.
got you.
And what about you?
Okay.
What languages do you speak?
I can speak Spanish pretty well, and I spent a lot of time in Turkey, so I can speak Turkish pretty well. And I studied French at university, but that one was a reading and writing based, instruction, and I don't really speak it that well, or even at all these days. Even though, like you said, I can still pretty much read it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Which is, I suppose, a perfect example of exactly what you were talking about before. And would you say that you've been able to get a greater understanding of the culture or perhaps learn something that you maybe never could have without those languages, being Spanish or Turkish?
I think so, because part of my teaching methodology is another slogan I use is, unlock the environment around you. And what I learned the most when I learned Turkish was my teachers were friends because I didn't really study the language. In fact, I can't read it or write it. And I was able to just really improve by sitting with some friends and having tea and mostly hearing them speak. Over time, I started to be able to start to laugh at their jokes. And then more time passed, and I started to be able to interject into the conversation a bit. And after, 9 months or a year, if for me, in my experience, I was finally able to be a part of the conversation. And then at that point, when people tried to speak English to me, I was like, let's just speak in Turkish. And when I was able to unlock the language, I was able to um, learn more about the culture because you can understand what people are saying, where before you might have not understood their language and therefore misinterpreted their body language, for example. Even somebody just saying, "Hey, how are you? Good morning," and they're very demonstrative. If you don't understand the language, you might almost think that there's an argument going on or something. So I think the two go hand in hand. And a lot of my clients are hoping to break into the English speaking business world. And so social cues are key for that. And it's definitely something I focus on in language learning.
Which I suppose proves a very important point, like you said, that language is not, it doesn't live in isolation, but rather, like you said, the body language or the facial expressions that we see might be very easy to misinterpret if you don't know the words, even
For
though the
sure,
body language is still exactly the same. Very, very good point.
for sure, for sure.
And for anybody listening that is maybe not very familiar with the Turkish culture, could you share any fun facts, any interesting things that you yourself were surprised to learn?
Some very simple things. For example, it's a breakfast culture, and I'm from the USA. And when I was growing up, breakfast was the meal I skipped if I skipped the meal. And if I ate breakfast, it was just a piece of toast or something very quick. And so when I finally was able to live in that culture, I immediately became a breakfast person. So just little things like that. And spending time in South America, little things like fresh squeezed juice, which in the USA is something very expensive. So, you might treat yourself or drink it semi-regularly, but I was able to, get into the juice culture, fresh juices. So little things like that. And I think those can become the long lasting things where you actually learn from a culture.
And Timo would love to come back a little bit to what you said before with your 9 months journey, potentially with what you were saying that first you would listen to the people speaking in Turkish and then you would slowly
Yeah,
begin to understand, and then
yeah.
only after those months you would become a part of that conversation. Did you ever consider that as your maybe language parent experience? Are you familiar with that theory?
Yes, definitely. What I try to do, I try also to inspire my students and clients to do the same. If I'm lucky enough to be able to spend some time in a foreign country, the first thing I try to do is connect with old contacts, connect with old friends, meet new people, because there's usually an interest in foreign people, wherever you are in the world. And so that's the thing I try to do the most is to assimilate into the culture as well as I can. Because in my experience, the the best way that I've learned personally, and it's something I try to insert into my methodology, is through usage, which in this case, it means it's good to have a one-to-one conversation. That's great. But in my case, even better is if you're able to be in a group where not only can you have a conversation, but you can even just listen. And so with my experience learning languages, it's interesting because with Turkish, I learned the conditionals, just through normal conversation. People are just saying, what if this, or, relitigating the past or whatever. And I am most comfortable in the third conditional in Turkish, which when I teach, and you start from the basics, and in the third conditional, the hypothetical past tense is usually the last one that you go through. And I have student after student saying, you know what, no thanks, or they're just scared, or they say it's so many words. Why do you have so many words in there? And I always try to bring it back to my personal experience. So I say, why, when I learned Turkish, was I most comfortable with that one that you're telling me is the most complicated one? And it's basically because it's so commonly used. And so those are the kinds of situations I try to put myself in if I'm lucky enough to have that situation. And not everybody travels, not everybody wants to travel, not everybody is able to. You might have a family or a job that demands your attention. But one of the things that's really helped my business, and I think language learning in general, is that you have access these days to podcasts like this one, YouTube, movies, music. So when you try to unlock your environment, one of my slogans for my business, if I'm dealing with a client who lives in the USA, we talk about making your life a living laboratory where you're always hearing the language. Try to listen a bit. You see signs around you. Everything's in English. But even if you're not, I try to inspire people to set up a mechanism in your life. This could be simple. Put your phone into English. Watch a series in English. A lot of simple ways like that.
And would you say that, because I'd love to again come back to your previous story with Turkish, that it wasn't what I think a lot of people are looking for, that okay, I'm gonna be fluent in 3 months, and okay, first of all, just let's slow it down a little bit. But I suppose your
Yeah.
experience is a wonderful way to show that it isn't really the case, or maybe we don't even want it to be the case. What's your say to people that think that way?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I actually had a client put it into a really good terms for me. He just said that language learning is a long-term plan. It's a long-term development. You can't really focus on the short term. You can, but I don't think you're ever going to get the nuances and reach the level that you want to come to. And a lot of my clients come to me and they say, I want 3 months, intense English. Let's go. And after that, I'll be good. And the 3 months sometimes is just about showing things that they've never even thought about. So for example, in English, one of the things I focus on a lot is how the language sounds, because I have the idea of understand better and be better understood. So in terms of understanding better, if you come to the USA and you want to be able to understand the English in the USA, and most English speaking countries, you have to understand the contractions and the contracted forms. So little things like that. Yeah. And for me, those over time, you can get those, but it's a challenge. So, I try to focus everybody and say, look, have a long-term mindset and realize that this is going to be a challenge. Because if it was easy, you could do it like that. And, how long does it take a child to learn a language? I mean, they learn fast, but that still is a matter of years. So, so it takes time.
Perfect. And could you share any examples of these contractions they were talking about?
Sure. Going back to the example of the third conditional, for example, it's funny because I'll have an example that says, if I had done that, that would not have happened, something like that. And then I'll say, okay, read this in your favorite way to say it, your perfect voice. And somebody will, say it pretty slowly. And then if I'd, you know, and that would have, wouldn't have, so there's always these shortcuts there. I try to focus people basically on um, is, am, is, are, um, do, does, did, would, and had. Some of these forms that are continuously cut. So, for example, the perfect tenses. I have seen it. That will almost always be I've seen it. I had seen it. I'd seen it. It's almost always going to have this cut form. And what I try to inspire people to do is listen, first, you have to understand what the right form is. And then second, you should try to figure out how it actually sounds. Because if in your mind you're saying I had done it, but in reality I'd done it, that's a pretty big difference. So you try to be aware of these things. And if it sounds this way, maybe you want to think about saying it this way. So it's a very interesting. I try to push people to do that a lot. And then, Marty, I had one time some pushback from some clients, and they were saying, "Listen, you're teaching us U.S. English. That's the U.S. accent. That I don't want to do that." And at first, I was like, "Come on, be open, try it out, see what you can do." But over time, I realized context matters. So some of my clients and some past students used to tell me, I'm from Asia and I'm doing business with people from other Asian countries. It doesn't make sense for me to say, what are you going to want to do? And that made sense to me. So I try that kind of opened my eyes where context matters. If you're coming to do business like a lot of my clients in the USA, I think you should be able to recognize that everything should be a contraction. Instead of saying I would go, you should say I'd go, or at least be able to understand that. But if you're doing business in English with people who really are not in an English speaking country, or you're in a different situation, I think that's a really good point that one of my old students made, and that makes sense.
For sure, Timo. And that's something that I've come across myself as well. We were looking at some, like you said, some contractions, some phrasal verbs, some idioms. And then my student looked at me and she said, no one's gonna understand me when I use that. And on the one hand, that
Right,
was very sad because we were super excited to learn it. But like you said, I mean, it's great, but it's not really useful. So finding a
right.
balance.
And some of the things that I do with all people that I try to work on is, for example, the letter T. The letter T is fascinating to me because in U.S. English you have a bunch of different ways to use it. Like, for example, my name Timo is the strong T, but then you have furniture, which is like a CH sound. Then you even have word like a name like Matt, which you kind of cut it off at the end. And then you have a place like Manhattan where you're not even saying the T sound. So you have a lot of different versions of it. But what I realized is almost everybody who comes to me and talks to me is using the strong T sound. So almost everybody will say to me that last weekend I went to Manhattan. So there's a couple of things that I try to focus on with everybody. The T sound is one of them. And another thing I try to focus on is you mentioned phrasal verbs. Most phrasal verbs will start with a preposition that starts with a vowel. So get up, for example. I try to focus a lot on how the words connect, right? Where it's basically saying get up, right? The word splits in the middle and connects to the next one. Or a phrase like I want it versus I wanted it. and I try to focus on how that middle word connects to the next word, because that's a way where you don't say I wanted it word by word by word. I try to focus a lot on how they connect together.
Certainly, certainly, which is a wonderful point, and then what you've been talking about, that it's not just the words, and I suppose this is where a lot of people get stuck with what you were talking about, the textbook kinds of language versus the real language, because in the textbook, like you said, it's I wanted it. Okay, well, that's what it should be, right? But in
Right,
reality, it's not really what you're going to be experiencing, so
right.
I do very much appreciate that point.
Yeah. And it's funny, a lot of times with that very proper I wanted it. My students will say to me, "Well, you're from the USA. I'm speaking British English." And that's always funny to me, because I say maybe the King of England, is saying I wanted it. But try to get into the culture a little bit more, try to watch a TV show that's a British TV show and see if they're saying wata or maybe what or I don't do the accent very well, but try to unlock your environment so that you're not going on a theory, but you're actually basing it in reality, and see what you can do.
And Timo, something else that I think is important in what you do, and I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about it, is your approachability, or perhaps the informality of what you do, from what I understand, that it's not
Yeah.
okay, here's a textbook, here's my tie and everything, but just being more like a friend, what you were talking about before. Why do you think that's important?
Well, I've always, when I started teaching, I started teaching because I enjoyed school, basically. And I always remember that I liked reading, I liked going to class, I didn't mind tests. And so I based my early classes right when I started in my early 20s on the idea if you're having a good time in the class, you're more likely to come, have good attendance, pay attention, give effort, etc. So that's where I started from. It doesn't mean you have to make jokes and things like that, but you can support somebody. You can make somebody feel comfortable. And I never really connected that with appearance. And in fact, kind of the opposite in a more casual way. And I'm always more comfortable if I feel comfortable than if I feel uncomfortable, as most people. And I have a lot of clients who are lawyers. And one time, one of them told me something very interesting. He said that a lot of my job dealing with a client is taking the law and explaining that in normal terms. So it's not giving legalese to a client, it's taking legalese and putting it into terms that they can understand, into layman's terms. And I thought about that a lot because if you're approachable, if you're kind, if you're friendly, if you're basically if you're yourself, I think that is more important than anything, really. So when you see me, it's a little cold in Boston, so I'm wearing a hoodie. But most of all, I just try to be myself, because a lot of communication is informal, as you know. And if I'm just myself, I think that I'm going to be able to express my ideas better than if not. And the key is, another funny story is a lot of people come to me and they'll say, if somebody says, "How are you?" What do I say? How do I answer that? And that one's pretty standard, like, "Fine, how are you?" But in the USA, people will say, "What's up?" or "How's it going?" or "How you been?" These little things like that. And so it's a lot of it is informal, because in the USA, if somebody says "What's up?" to you, you cannot say, "I'm fine, how are you?" Like, it doesn't work. So these are kind of things where a lot of the language is informal anyway. So basically what I do is I try to start with these basics, and try to make a person less robotic and more human, and the rest will fall into place, and however they are as a person hopefully will come out.
And have you noticed that a lot of people struggle with that, that they've been taught in a certain way and changing that, would you say, from your experience or from your students' experiences, does that require, would you say, more time or more effort, or what has that been like in your experience?
I think, in my experience, a lot of what I try to do is to say, okay, what is the right answer? Why was your answer wrong? Or what was the right thing to say? Why was what you said the wrong thing? And step three, if you know what the answer is, if you know why you made the mistake, step three, can you change your behavior? And that's the part that's really on the person. And I think that's why when language learning is a long-term development thing, I think that's the thing because nobody knows yet how to change behavior. You have whole industries that are built around that. The advertising industry is an entire industry built on changing behavior, waste management and recycling and things like this. It's to try to change behavior, but science hasn't really figured out a foolproof way to change behavior. And so that's the part that can be just like that for some people. Other people, it takes a little bit longer. But that's always the challenge, you know. If I can tell you that this is the right answer and you understand it, the last step is okay, the next time that situation comes up, are you able to do it? And what I try to do is just repetition, a lot of repetition on making it automatic. A lot of it is through the phonetics. So, for example, with noun clauses is one of the big trouble areas where somebody will say, "I don't know what is the answer," you know, and it's coming out so fluidly. "I don't know what is it. I don't know what is it." And I'm like, "Hold on, you know, what's the problem here?" That's not a question. So you're not saying what is it, right? So the what you need to be doing is, "I don't know what it is." Now, step three, how are you going to break the years of practice that you've had saying it the wrong way because that sounds right to you? So, how are you going to break that down and then relearn a habit until you've got it the right way? And that's the process that time, you know, it's different for everybody. The process is different, the length of time is different, and that's the biggest challenge.
And have you noticed any patterns in that for anybody listening that is in the exact same boat that, okay, I've been making the same mistake for 10 years. What do I do?
I try to make it funny, you know. For example, just I'll make the example of going to a gym and doing repetitions. You know, if you are trying to get, or you're trying to get big biceps, you're gonna go and do bicep curls. And okay, so how often do you do that? Okay, twice a week. When you do bicep curls, how many reps do you do? Okay, 10. How many sets? 4. Okay, so 10 times 4 is 40. So can you go to your mirror and just say, "I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is," 40 times. And it's kind of ridiculous. Everybody always laughs because you picture yourself just standing in front of your mirror, just saying that. And, you know, that's a bit of an extreme example. But what if you did? You know, what if you did? Um, when I was studying French, I studied Spanish first. So French pronunciation and Spanish pronunciation is basically different worlds. And I can remember living in Boston, riding the train with my French book, trying to pronounce these words. But I didn't want to look like a crazy person, you know, just strange. I mean, so I would do it under my breath. So I made sure nobody around me could hear me as I'm repeating these words. And maybe I looked a little funny that I was, you know, talking, but that was my way to try to do the repetition. Um, and it's something that I think is kind of funny because I always say here's a way you could try, but I know you're not going to try it, and everybody will kind of laugh. I just try to make it a little bit funny, and because in the end, what you do, what I do, you can show somebody the way to walk. You can give them some tools and things like that, but in the end, you can't walk the path for them. And the the other thing I do is I try to put it in my own experience. So how did I do it for myself? I'm not perfect, absolutely, but I had a few tips. Surrounded myself with people, endless practice. I found out what my problem letters were and my problem sounds. I found out what parts I'm trying to bring from English into the new language that I shouldn't be doing. So I tried to recognize a lot of things like that I would do when I would speak another language. And a lot of what I do with a client is first to say, look, let's diagnose you. What are the things that you're doing from your own language? What are your repetitive mistakes? What are your problem letters when you're pronouncing something? And that's your roadmap. That's your prescription for what ails you. And then, I'll help you and support you, but I can't sit in your business meeting. So in the end, it comes down to, are you able to implement some changes, and how important is it to you? How much time do you have? What's going on in your life? And then that's kind of the mix that determines the time.
And I think that flows very nicely into something that I hear very often, and I'm sure you do too, since you mentioned that a lot of your clients are lawyers. A lot of people always say that I don't have the time to practice. And I say, look, you have 5 minutes every day. I can guarantee that you have at least 5 minutes. If you don't, reevaluate your schedule. But I'm sure you have at least 5 minutes, like you said, to say something 20 or 30 times.
For sure. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because that's another thing people always say. I'll say, how much do you think you should study per day? And it's always an hour, 2 hours.
Nice.
And I'm like, who has that time? Nobody has an hour. But exactly like you said, do you have 5 minutes? And I make it funny again. I'm like, when you use the restroom, there you go. There's your 5 minutes, and you're done. And I think you're right about that for sure. And I also say, listen, if you're able to block a client for 30 minutes, block yourself for 30 minutes or 15. Put it on your online schedule if you use that. Try and schedule yourself. Marty, that's something I struggle with my business. I'm trying to develop a business, be more effective as a leader. And I have to say, listen, use your own words, block yourself a time. So I try daily to put into my online schedule like 30 minutes and I'll name the task. And if I don't do that, things usually don't happen. But if I do that, it can happen.
Which is a very powerful, I would say, message in general, not just like you said for language learning, but for business, for really anything, for exercise, for anything that you're trying to achieve in life. Because I feel like we get the sense that, oh, I'll find time, I'll make time.
Yeah,
But will
yeah,
you?
yeah,
Can you?
yeah. Right.
And in terms of what you were talking about with the sitting in somebody's meeting, the first thing that came to mind, I mean, Zoom online meetings are probably much more prevalent, or at least where I suppose a lot of people are going back into, let's say, normal life now. But in terms of online communication, online conversations, when there are, for example, something that I get very often when there are some interruptions and you can hear kind of part of somebody's words, and especially if it's another language, then you're like, no, no, no,
Right.
I cannot be doing
Right.
that. Do you have any tips,
Right.
any recommendations for online communication?
Well, I think it's getting a little bit easier. The pandemic, now we're in 2023, the pandemic is getting further and further away. And that sort of sparked, at least for me, the work from home. So right now I'm in my home office. What is a challenge for me is if I'm working from home, um, I need to get enough sunlight. I need to get out of the house. I need to have some human contact, because I learned this in the first year or so when I was working from home, that I was just alone all the time with the cat and some plants and some four
I
walls.
can relate.
And yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think I just try to find the human element in it. Even if it's an online meeting, at some point you can maybe get together, or if you can't get together, I like icebreakers. I don't do a lot of icebreakers, but I like them, and I've heard some very creative ones, like for example, show me something from your house that's important to you. And for me, that's easy. I'll just grab a plant. And, little things like that, you can find the human elements in it. Because the critical point for you and I when in our industry is how do you deal with the emotional aspects of the language? Because I have clients who are CEOs, partners in law firms, even politicians, business owners, it doesn't even matter what they do. You're dealing with being intimidated, being afraid, because you can be super successful in your own business. You can be the boss, you can be the owner. But when you're pitching something in another language, or when you're having a meeting in another language, something happens. One of my clients told me once that he was in a meeting as the partner and just kind of sitting quietly in the corner. And he was like, I understood what was going on. I got it all. There wasn't a problem. But he didn't have that last just ability to interject into the conversation. And he definitely wasn't in position to run the conversation, even though that is his position. And so online, it's hard. It's hard because you miss a lot of the body language. You miss a lot of the facial expressions, and even some cultures, like Turkish culture, body contact, even, so US culture is not so much of a body contact thing, but based on the culture, you miss all of these things. And finding the human element is a pretty critical thing. I just try to focus with my clients on, make the learning experience relevant to you, make it applicable to your life. Can you pitch your company, right? Can you do you need to learn US English, or will it be a more international version? Can you use the common vocabulary of your industry? Make it relevant. And then hopefully when you do go get the coffee together, or when you do have the business lunch, you've these things come out of you automatically, and you've already broken the ice, so that it's a bit less awkward. Your performance is a little bit better, and your personality comes through.
And Timo, for people in that position, like you said, that I know all of the words, I understand everything, but I still can't say, like you said, I can't interject within the conversation. Would you say that is proportionally mindset that makes that happen, or why do you think that happens, and what would you say are some remedies?
I think personality has a lot to do with it, because some people are just naturally introverts, some people are naturally extroverts. Some of my clients burst through every conversation and they're riddled with errors, and I'm correcting every question, I'm correcting every third word, but they don't care. And with a client like that, I usually have to try to rein them in and say, listen, your strength is your personality, right? But what you're doing right now is you're successful through the force of your personality in spite of the language. So we'll come back to earth, and here are your main mistakes, right? So keep going with what you're going with, but just also keep in mind that you have this. Other extroverted people, it could be the exact opposite, where you're like, listen, you're doing this, this, and this perfectly. So break the ice. A lot of times I have a three-step method. Um, Step one is communicate. Step two is communicate with good grammar, and then communicate with good grammar and good pronunciation. Step one, simply communicate, is either the easiest or the hardest. There's usually not an in between. You know what I mean? Because that's the part where who cares about your grammar? Who cares about your pronunciation, right? I base that on myself because when I lived in Colombia, and my Spanish was okay. When I first got there, I spent a year there doing a fellowship. And when I first got there, I wasn't confident just going into a restaurant and asking what's in a dish, because I didn't recognize the name of the dish, but the restaurant smelled great, it looked great. I was hungry. And I wouldn't go in there and say, hey, I'll take this or I'll take that. What's in it? What do you recommend? I would just go home hungry. And for me, once I broke the ice and I was a little bit confident in just my ability to ask some questions and maybe understand the key words that they were saying to me, that was key for me. Because at that point, I was able to say, okay, ajiaco, I see this everywhere. I see that word everywhere. What actually is it? And they're like, oh, it's a soup that's very famous, a traditional soup, and definitely try it and eat it like this. And then I'm like, okay, I got that. So it's different for everybody. But I usually say, look, if you can communicate and break that ice, then from there you can move on to the little parts. And also, it's like a self-reinforcing model, because if you're able to just communicate, you'll hear more. If you're hearing more, you'll communicate better. If you're communicating better, you'll hear more. It's the model that reinforces itself.
A little bit of a catch-22, just gotta get started.
For sure, for sure, for sure.
And I would say that's a really wonderful link to what we were talking about before with the cultural aspects that you can't really, or it's much more difficult at least to get a hang of if you don't know the language and what you just shared. Okay, I'm seeing that everywhere. Oh, it's a soup. Now it makes a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
sense. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
wonderful.
And you end up learning funny stuff like in that country in Colombia, for example, they one of the common breakfasts is a soup with maybe some eggs and rice and hot chocolate. And for me, it's so strange to have soup for breakfast. But hey,
With the hot
okay, when in
chocolate.
Rome, with a hot chocolate, right? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. So I started ordering that. And now, if I'm ever lucky enough to visit there, or really in general, it doesn't have to be Colombia, soup for breakfast sounds good. Sounds good. So I've kind of changed around a bit. I would still go coffee over hot chocolate, but I wouldn't pass up the hot chocolate.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. And would you say that that comes into potentially some kind of cultural competence that you've developed over time, like you said, having lived and having taught in a lot of different cultures, few different countries, would you say that you developed that again, that competence potentially that you understand, okay, this is just what they do here.
Well, in general, I think if you're attempting to develop your language abilities, that probably means that you have some sort of an interest in other cultures. It's not always the case. Maybe you just want to do business and earn some money and get some clients. But I find a lot of cases, someone who's from a different country will be talking about the USA and they'll say, so what's New York City like? Just a quick question, and that's culture, you know. So I find that if you're attempting to develop your language abilities, I think you're probably interested in foreign cultures. And my way is to embrace that. I'm sort of extroverted when it comes to other cultures. I just like to dive in because I see it as a respect thing. Um, but in vice versa, when people come to the USA, there's a very specific culture here and a specific way of doing things. It's pretty in your face and it's fast paced and all the cliches are pretty true. And if you're able to dive into that, that can work. That can work here. And if you can just assimilate into the society and penetrate it and meet some people, I think that goes a long way. One of the first things I ask any student who is here or anyone who is living here, one of the first things I ask is, okay, how long have you been here? How long will you be here? And do you have a friend yet who's from here? And as you probably know, that answer is almost always no. But it's almost always I want to. I would like to do that. How do I do that? So that's one of the first things I say, like, have you met somebody yet? And even better, have you met your friend's friends, right? Like, have you met
Ooh.
a little group where, because I think you'll find in my country, and I've experienced it in reverse in other countries, if you just say, I'm from I'm from Poland, I'm in the USA for a short amount of time, what's fun to do? Something simple like that, or like, where's a good cafe? If you've got time, can I buy you a coffee? Usually in this country, that can work where you get a next meeting, because somebody's going to be interested in your story and where you're from and what you're doing. But most of the people who are in that situation are a little bit just hesitant to do that. And so I'm like, if there's if one person says back off, basically, you'll know and back off. And how many people live in Boston? It's like 6 million or something like that. So one rejection, there's 5,999,999 more people. And that's a mindset. But I think if you're willing to develop your language abilities, it's because some part of you is interested in the culture, and I think the culture is interested in you, and the culture is able to accept you. It has the bandwidth to accept you.
I like that it works the other way around as well. Like you
Yeah,
said, I mean, one more person isn't going to crumble the system, hopefully. So,
right, right. And
wonderful.
that's how you make it lasting, if you're able to travel even for a couple of days somewhere. I mean, how much better would it be if you were just randomly able to meet somebody and spend a day that way versus kind of taking pictures and sightseeing? In my experience, the people interactions are the memorable ones, and you might pick up at least some bad words, at least little things like that will stick with you. Yeah,
Perfect, perfect. And Timo, for anybody listening to this that is at the edge of their seat thinking, okay, where do I find this guy? Where can people
yeah.
find you? Where can people follow you?
You can find me on Instagram very easily, Professor.Timo. You can visit my website, professortimo.com, or just email me, Timo at professortimo.com. I try to put out a video on Instagram once per week, mostly focusing on pronunciation tips. Yeah, so please reach out to me. Even if you're not trying to be a client, even if you're not trying to take classes, I've got some products, a grammar book, and coming out with another grammar book, some videos online. But even if you just have a question, reach out because it's one of my passions. That's why I'm doing the business. So I like to talk. So
Wonderful.
and thank you very much, Marty, for having me on and a really interesting conversation.
Thank you too. Thank you too. And just before I let you go, for a final piece of advice, piece of wisdom, something that we haven't touched on before, but still something that you would like to share?
Yeah, I think you can. One thing that is helpful is what are your pains and gains? An example of a pain is you don't want to be embarrassed. An example of a gain is you can You can enjoy a show better, right? If you're able, imagine you're able to watch it without subtitles and you get it. So you can make a list of your pains and gains. But if you think about it that way, some things are probably stopping you, and they're your pains. Some things are probably motivating you, and those are your gains. The more you know about that, and the more you can understand yourself, because in the end, you need some motivation that's gonna start you. And the last thing I can say, Marty, is one thing I do is try to put a mechanism in your life. So, for example, I watch soccer, and in the USA, I can watch it on the English channel or the Spanish speaking channel. And I know I'm going to watch the game anyway, so I just watch it in Spanish. And it's something I like to do and I do regularly, and then it doubles as a 90-minute lesson. Uh, so if you can find a way to put some easy mechanisms in your life, I think that will go a long way.
Perfect. Perfect. And a really good excuse. So I'm not lazy. I'm learning.
For sure, for sure. I can watch this show because it's a lesson. Exactly.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, Timo. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and I'm sure that anybody that listened to us today has learned a lot from.
Well, thank you very much again, Marty. Yeah, I think your podcast is great and you're a really great host for it. So thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm glad to see you here. Let me know what you most enjoyed about this conversation, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one. Do zobaczenia.